This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Laura Horak, who is the author of a new book, Trans Cinema, Communities, Identities and Worlds. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here.
It's so good that you could join me because I read your book and it was fascinating and struck me as a much needed work, especially in the current climate. And this is something which you refer to yourself in the conclusion and the introduction of the book. One of the things I guess would be my first question is how did you arrive at this subject, and how did you arrive at looking at cinema itself in the whole?
Sure. Well, I've always loved movies. Growing up, I always tried to watch a lot of movies. And I also always had a lot of questions about why gender and sexuality work the way they do in our society. Why were there rules about what women could do and not do, and who had made them, and how could they change? And so I've always been interested in this connection between the way movies work and the way gender and sexuality works. And actually, when I was first getting started on this, when I was an undergrad, in fact, I started researching the earliest cinema, so silent cinema, and I ended up doing my PhD dissertation on cross-dressing women and lesbians in early American cinema. And I actually found that there was lots of cross-dressing women and lots of lesbians, really pretty explicit depictions of lesbianism, especially in the 1920s, even before Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich, the icons that we think about. And so I was really interested in this earlier era because you could see how much had changed and what hadn't changed. And so I was teaching a class on cinema, gender, and sexuality throughout history, and I had written my lecture about the importance of filmmaking to the women's movement in the 70s and 80s and how they created alternate distribution networks. I'd written my lecture about queer experimental filmmaking and new queer cinema, and then I went to write a lecture about trans filmmaking, and I couldn't find anything written about it. And I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and I lived for many years in San Francisco. So I had seen lots of trans-made films. I knew they existed. I knew there were trans film festivals, but when I looked both in academic writing and in critics writing, I couldn't find anything about it. So I called up one of my mentors, who's one of the great trans historians, Susan Stryker, who also is a filmmaker. She made a fantastic documentary called Screaming Queens. And I said, Susan, what should I read? What am I not finding? And she said, it hasn't really been written down. A lot of the film programmers, have a lot of knowledge about trans filmmaking, but I don't know anyone who's really written all that stuff down. So that's when I started. I actually started with a list. I just started with a list of trans-made films in an Excel sheet. And then I was like, well, I should share this list somehow. And that was the impetus that started the kind of companion project to this book, which is the Transgender Media Portal, which is a website. It's like IMDb, but for trans filmmakers. But a website like that with more thousands of films, is very overwhelming. So I also kind of wanted to tell the story of trans cinema in the US and Canada over the last few decades. And so that's really the impetus behind writing this book.
It's really interesting as well that you say in the book that this is quite a narrow geographical thing, and what I liked about the promise of the book is sort of like this is the beginning of the end of the beginning, rather the beginning of the end. This is
Yes.
we need to go out there and do more of this, and it seems like we've heard this advice time and time again on this podcast of writers saying, write the book you want to read, write the
Yes.
book that's not there. So it's great to hear you doing that. But also, I mean, it seems to be you say this at the very beginning of the book that the trans cinema and what you've just been saying now, trans cinema is as old as cinema itself.
Yes, it's true. So both in what you see on screen and in the people behind the camera. So the most obvious part of the history is cross-dressing has been an essential part of human entertainment as well as kind of rituals and things probably for all of human history. And it certainly has been essential to theater, to vaudeville, and to early cinema. There was tons of cross-dressing, men dressed as women, men playing women's roles, and women dressed as men, either disguised or playing boy roles. And so if you look through every single decade of cinema, you're going to find a lot of cross-dressing, and a lot of that cross-dressing will also play on questions of sexuality, questions of desirability. It's not all one thing. It's not all, haha, let's make fun of this silly person. I mean, some of it is that, but a lot of it's not. But then if you also look behind the camera, well, for one thing, we know 100 years ago, there was all these newspaper reports that people who everyone thought was a man turned out to have been assigned female. Usually when they die, right? This is when their bodies are inspected, or vice versa. People everyone thought was a woman turns out they were assigned male. So we know that there was lots of people living the lives they wanted to live 100 years ago. I mean, they didn't have all the kind of identity systems back then that we have now that would make that difficult. And so we can only imagine that there are people we don't know about. But then there's some people we do know about, such as actors and theater performers who regularly were female impersonators or male impersonators, or sometimes there's young girls who only played male roles. And so they were making movies. And then we also know of people who had really, say, women with really mannish styles who were also making movies. I mean, an early famous example of that is Dorothy Arzner. But even before that, in the silent era, and we have books written by intersex, what we would today call intersex or trans people. Those terms were still being invented back then. We have memoirs written by them, and those memoirs were then adapted to film. Sadly, the 90% of silent films are lost, so a lot of these films are lost. But you can see even in that early era that both representations of gender crossing of different kinds and people who lived lives that were at odds with their assigned genders were just essential. And I will note that, and this was what Susan Stryker, the mentor I mentioned, she talks about this in the documentary called Disclosure, that the cinema as a medium was invented at the very same time as the terms transvestite and homosexual and sexual invert was what they called people who had, genders different from the ones assigned to them. Like those things were happening at the very same time. So it's maybe not a surprise that we see this connection all through cinema history.
Yeah, it's a really it's really interesting how we tend to think of things as I guess it's baseline bias as things just start now when we arrive. But actually, yeah, there's a long history of that. Sometimes that history has been erased, and as you made reference to there, the language might be different, the terminology might be different, and we've got to be careful of not patronizing the past because I think we're still struggling with finding language and that is acceptable to everyone, specifically, the people involved, most importantly, the people involved. So in the book, there feels like there's a very interesting moment happening around the 2000s with the TV series that comes out which unfortunately has been sort of muddied by the reputation of the lead actor, Jeffrey Tabor, is it Tabor?
Yeah, yeah,
Transparent, yes.
transparent. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but there's a kind of slew of material as well. The Danish Girl comes out around about that time. Dallas Buyers Club comes out at that time. Boys Don't Cry is a little bit earlier, but a lot of this material is material which is being made by Chiz filmmakers, cisgendered filmmakers. And
Cis, yeah.
cis, sorry, okay.
No problem, no problem.
Again,
Yeah, you're in Italy, yeah.
my Italian, we had
Yes,
the ciao, it's
yes.
yeah, the cis. But you have a point that one of the people you cite has a problem with using cis
That's
as a
true.
phrase. But you sort of justify it as, well, we've got to use it in a similar way as a political category, the way we do white. So we're not saying the default is nothing or is normal or something like that. What do you think is worthwhile, if anything, about these cis formulated versions of transgender portrayal?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. And I will note that that there's these sort of repeating waves of all of a sudden the media is really interested in trans people and then it kind of recedes and then it comes back. So I think we can see this in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s, and then in the 2000s. So it's very typical of journalists to be like, "Oh, we've never seen this before. What's going on? Let's find out." When like 10 years ago they did the same story basically. You can think of like the Crying Game as being the earlier moment where everyone's like, "Ah, what is trans?" But yes, unquestionably the 2000s were really important, and the films that you mentioned and the TV show Transparent. And so I think one thing that's different about them compared to earlier representations is that they tend to be fairly sympathetic towards trans people. They're showing them as human beings. Previously, trans people were often seen as psycho killers or the butt of a joke or something. And so that's important as kind of this liberal humanist look at trans people as like as people. And however, oftentimes they become human and they become relatable to the audience by virtue of their suffering and often their death. Obviously, like in Boys Don't Cry and Dallas Buyers Club, the trans people are always dying. And so they only become worthy of cis sympathy through these tales of tragedy, which is clearly limited, especially if you're a trans person looking for, ideas about what the world is like and what your life could be like. If all you see is trans people dying, it's very depressing. Um, so so these films they often take non-trans people to be the audience. They want to explain trans people to cis people. They also know that cis people are curious about trans people's bodies. What do they look like? What have they done? What have they not done? What do they want to do? And so it really caters to that kind of almost prurient curiosity about genitals. And it's the cis people who are able to sort of bestow worthiness to the trans characters here. So they certainly were really important, and people really had to fight to get those movies made, like Boys Don't Cry, for example. However, they are really lacking from the perspective of trans audiences, where they don't necessarily want to just have trans explained to them and then die. They want to like live full, complicated lives like everyone else, and they want to see that, on screen. And so I think that's one of the problems is that when you just have that one type of story, it really limits trans people to being victims ultimately and to not have their own agency or even complexity. They just have to be noble, suffering people who die, which is a really common, I will say, structure of melodrama that people like Linda Williams and Christine Gledhill have written. That is really a overwhelming structure in American culture and other cultures as well. So it's not a surprise that we take these structures of melodrama and use them to tell these stories, but there's real limits to those stories. And I will say briefly on this question of cis, yeah, it is within trans studies kind of an open question and very much debated whether that's a helpful term because saying there's cis and then it's the opposite of trans, it just sets up this binary, which, like all binaries, then tends to kind of oversimplify the situation. It doesn't take into account people who, say, people from indigenous communities who have genders that are not set up under a binary like in Western cultures. And also, it sort of pretends that cis people, that is people whose genders align with the one assigned them at birth, don't have any kind of gender troubles themselves, and that everything about them is just kind of simple and easy. And that's not really true either. And it's especially not true for people who are marginalized, like people of color, Black people, who are not kind of accepted into the mainstream white middle class norms of gender and sexuality because of discrimination. And so I think there's a lot of good arguments against cis, or why cis is too simplistic. But like you say, I use it in a more strategic sense to show that it's not like women and trans women, like, and that the default is non-trans. That, say the category women includes all sorts of women, including cis and trans women, and cis is used to mark an otherwise unmarked category, just like using white rather than just saying women and women of color. Like you would want to mark that that it's the white is not the default. So it's just my way of showing that that the cis or non-trans is not the default.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to make a recommendation to our listeners as well for a film that hopefully will be coming out soon. I saw it at Cannes, called Elephants in the Fog, which is a Nepalese film by Abhinash Bikram Shah. And this film set in the sort of foots of the Himalayas, and a Nepalese film, and it has a sort of third sex community, which is like almost a religious sect who are considered by the rest of the community to occupy elements of male and female. And it's a just beautifully made film, really, really wonderful, really interesting. And it shows that gender identity, it has multifarious expressions throughout the world. So that's I really enjoyed it. It was at Cannes, and I think it should get some sort of release, hopefully in the States and the UK, and broader, because it certainly deserves it. So to go back to a sort of a more historical view, you already say something you've already kind of referred to, which is how trans bodies and trans people are displayed or set up for a cis audience. And you refer to this in the book as they're either seen as jokes. In terms of lots of comedies, you quote Naked Gun, Part Three, Sexual Deceivers, which is the crying game, which I remember seeing at the cinema, and everybody being very it was kind of the twist. It's like Psycho, she gets killed in the
Yes.
shower. Suddenly we have a penis
Yep.
there. As victims, Boys Don't Cry would be an example, and Psycho Killers. One of the things I found really interesting, I love this idea that some of the sort of negative, or what we would see maybe superficially as negative portrayals, can actually be sort of figured by a trans audience as empowering. But yeah, if the toss up is between the Danish girl and, Buffalo Bill, I'll be Buffalo
Hmm.
Bill. Thank you very much.
Yes, yes, it's true. There's this real interest in reclaiming trans monsters right now, precisely for that reason you suggest. That yeah, in the kind of positive representations like Boys Don't Cry, it's just trans people getting killed over and over and over. They're just victims, right? But in these different kinds of horror films and thrillers, they have a lot of power, actually. They get to reshape the world they want as they want. I think it is, and Susan Stryker, who I've mentioned a few times, in the 90s, she wrote this great essay where she identifies with Frankenstein's monster and talks about the kind of connections between, flesh being sewed up into something new, but also being seen by society as a monster, and how that's both alienating and lonely, but also a position of power, that you have the ability to kind of overthrow the natural order. And so I think a lot of trans, especially like younger trans people, I see this a lot in my students. There's this, they love horror, and there's this real fascination with the monsters of horror, and especially the way they often can totally undo the kind of normal rules of gender and the normal rules of who has power and who doesn't have power. So Cale Keegan has been writing about what he calls bad trans objects. So things that a lot of people, a lot of trans people too, might say like this is bad representation, this is negative representation, we don't want this. But then other trans people might say, no, I actually find that really fun. I find it really exuberant, to identify or to watch trans monsters wreak havoc. Like we all love like Godzilla, right? Even though like of course he does terrible damage, but like we just want to see him over and over, right? So it's the same thing, I think. And actually there's a really cute trans Godzilla short too that I would recommend. But
Excellent.
um yeah, Godzilla has a child who has some gender questions. But anyway, but yeah, so I do think I do want, even as I want to show like a lot of these old representations are, they're cliches, they're definitely negative representations, they are not accurate, but they people can have fun with film in all kinds of unexpected ways, and the point is not just that you want to see your community represented only as upstanding, good citizens. Like that's one thing, but like offers so many other kinds of pleasures too.
It's almost like there are, I mean, you don't want to invoke a narrative of progress on which there are these steps that we have to go through. And, you could see that in terms of how Black people have been represented. You see that in terms of how women have been represented with the femme fatale and then
Yes.
increasingly more powerful and, and complicated and interesting characters. Um, but it does almost seem like you have to go through a stage where you can only be baddies or you can only be a
Hmm.
joke before being taken seriously. Yeah, it's very open to debate whether that progress has really taken place, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's most important to me and the focus of the book is that regardless of what gets represented or who and how, like trans people should be making creative decisions. They should be in positions of power in the process of filmmaking or TV making. And likewise, they should be taken seriously as audiences too. And so that's why the book really, I really try to show as many different kinds of genres and kinds of stories and formats and aesthetic strategies, like that there's no one or two formula that is like the right thing. But it's like when you give trans people the cameras, you get all kinds of great stuff that, it's just more limited when you just give cis people the cameras, say, talk about trans people. You get much more, and some of those stories can be really great. Some of the films are great. I love Tomboy, for example. Um, but you just don't get that wide variety and those kind of innovative aesthetics that you get when trans people take up the camera.
Well, that's a great point, actually, for us to move on with our discussion because we've so far been talking about cis people representing trans people. Let's talk about trans people representing trans people. How does trans cinema relate to queer cinema? That's an important thing to distinguish, I feel.
Yes, and it might be one of the, I don't know, one of the different things that I say in the book compared to what has been said. So new queer cinema in the 1990s was very critically acclaimed. A lot of academics wrote about it, and rightfully, because you have this new younger generation, new at the time, of queer filmmakers who were making films precisely that were not wholesome, right? They were not good citizens. It was all kinds of, you know, like killers and people having, uh, you know, power imbalance, relations, all this kind of stuff, right? And so a lot of times people, academics and critics, will kind of put trans films underneath the umbrella of new queer cinema, or I'll often see that they'll say, okay, first came the queer films and then later came the trans films. Um, and certainly you have someone like Almodovar who includes trans women characters and actors in his films. However, at the time, there were also like out transsexual, transgender people, transvestites, people using all those terms, who were making films, and those films were not necessarily getting programmed in what was called at the time lesbian and gay film festivals. Um, in some places like San Francisco, there was a lot of connection between transgender people and lesbian and gay people. Like that's where Susan Stryker was working. She was part of Frameline, the Lesbian and Gay Film Festival. In other places, like in Toronto near me, there was a real divide, and trans people were more concerned with their material conditions, the conditions of sex work, of being able to find a home, find a job, not get beat up, not get arrested, or, and so those trans creators were not as interested in the kind of aesthetic experiments of new queer cinema, and the people doing new queer cinema were not as interested in the work being made by those people. So there was a real divide, and that's where you see a lot of trans people being like, no, we need to do it for ourselves. Queer film festivals, which again at the time were called lesbian and gay, they're not including us. Like they don't care about our concerns. Um, and again, it was different in different places, but there was definitely that sense in the 90s that lesbian and gay film festivals are not really including trans people either as creators or as audience members. Sometimes they would get like a side eye if they arrived in those spaces. So in 1997, you have the first trans film festival, specifically trans multi-year film festivals in San Francisco, Toronto, and London. And that really sparked this, now that there's people to watch things and there's a sense of a community building, there was just a lot more work made by openly trans people. And that work did not get written about by critics, by academics, even though it was going on at the same time as new queer cinema. And that was immensely frustrating to the people who were making the work and running the festivals, that they were getting shut out of the work that was getting written about. I think there's still today, trans and queer are like two circles that overlap, and there's some people who are very comfortable with both identities, with both communities, but then there's people too who are on the outsides of those circles who don't feel comfortable. Trans people, straight trans people don't, they might not identify as queer or feel that they have a lot in common with the queer community. Some members of the queer community can be some of the most transphobic people. And so there's sometimes been an assumption, especially in academia, that queer and trans are the same, or that they are, that you can talk about them all without thinking through the specificities of their experiences. But I'm part of a group of people who say, no, I think you really should take trans seriously on its own. It can still be overlapping with queer. It can still have things in common, but it's not enough to say, oh, queer cinema and then like stick a trans movie in there and be like, okay, I'm done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even the queer community is not monolithic for any,
Absolutely.
so how we wish we could all live together.
I
But
know, I know. It's true.
unfortunately,
It's true.
human complexity is just what it is. So I guess
Yeah.
we have to deal with what we're given and do our best. Yeah, so there are several films that you look at, and I love the point that you made as well about film workers. We're not just talking about directors here. The one of the most famous trans film workers that you reference in the book as well is Wendy Carlos, the wonderful
That's right.
composer, one of my favorite composers actually, who did music for Stanley Kubrick films amongst others. So there are trans people working in the industry and doing a lot of work in the industry, not simply as directors, but as with most film studies, we do tend to look to the director to have the sort of authorial voice, and so you've focused in on several of these in order to look at the themes, the way of treating the trans lived experience. and you break these up into various sort of broader themes. So for instance, you talk about family as being one of them. You talk about the policing of the trans in terms of brushes with the legality of what's going on, and legal categories and such like. The actual process of transitioning. And I think the thing that's kind of interesting here as well is how throughout this are you reveal so many different filmmakers and formats by which these are being done in shorts, they're being done in experimentals, or web series, YouTube videos. Um, and at the end of each chapter, you give like a recommended film. So I just wanted to give you like a bit of space to talk about how you approach those themes and some films that we can already throw out. I think one of them that you use very early on, 1,000 Cuts,
Mm.
was which I went and had a look at. It's fantastic sort of experimental short piece, which is taking clips from other films, from cis representations of trans, and juxtaposing, put them side by side in three boxes so that we can sort of almost by the amount of them, we sort of get the point.
Yeah, yeah,
Sometimes
yeah.
literally.
I love that film. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the book is organized like a seminar because I was teaching a seminar on trans
Mm,
cinema to fourth year undergrads and master's students. I thought it would be useful to make something like that that's approachable for people who don't necessarily know anything about trans, or they might not know anything about film studies, but they can nonetheless kind of find out what they need to know to and learn about films. And so, like my classes, in each class, we would watch one or two movies or a movie and a web series, and then we would do some readings. And so, at the end of each chapter, there's sort of assigned films and assigned readings, if you want to take up the invitation. And yeah, so in that first chapter where I talk about this long history of representing trans people. I find the 1,000 Cuts, which is, as you say, it's like three screens, and they just cut together a bunch of shots from thrillers, from comedies, and they juxtapose them. And so there's no narration or anything, but it just uses film form itself and montage or editing to kind of get across the sort of endless barrage of these cliches of trans representation. And so it's very clever and kind of overwhelming film to watch. And it is, I believe it's still available on Vimeo for free to watch. And then I paired that with Disclosure, which I mentioned, which is a director by Sam Fader that was distributed on Netflix, which I really recommend as a great starting place for anyone interested in this topic because what he does is he asks trans filmmakers and actors from today, like Laverne Cox, and they tell their own stories about how they encountered representations of trans people, which ones they were really inspired by, which ones were really hurtful to them, experiences they've had in the industry as people working, trans people working in the industry. And so it's this great, really complex kind of history of representation, but also like compilation of stories. And you can see how differently like different trans people found films like The Crying Game or Boys Don't Cry. The different people who tell their stories had really different reactions to those films. Like Zachary Drucker in The Crying Game, in this scene that's been, widely criticized after the character sees a penis, he goes through and throws up, right? It's very like, which several of the people in Disclosure say like that. I felt like I was gonna die seeing that. But Zachary Drucker was like, I didn't know you could have such a beautiful woman with a penis, and this like my whole life, kind of changed upon knowing that. So, so that's a more traditional documentary, rather than the experimental form, but it's also unique in that it's giving trans people voices to tell this story in a way it hasn't. And I know that a lot of executives, industry executives, but also people like judges have watched Disclosure, and it has opened their eyes to these kind of these tropes that they might not have realized were informing their thinking about trans people. But then as you say, community and family. That's how I start the book after the kind of historical chapters when I start looking at films closely. So often when people, these kind of traditional cis stories about trans people, they're about violence and victimization, or they're about bodies, right, and transition and medical procedures. But really, a kind of much more important aspect of trans people's lives is like how they live in community, who supports them, who they support, who they love, who loves them. And so that's why I started with the first chapters about community and kinship outside of given families, and then the next chapter is about given families, so children and parents and things. And so the ones about community, I include both Sense8, the great series by the Wachowskis, and Wildness, a documentary by Wu Sang about a club in LA and the different kinds of trans people, both uh, immigrants, Latina immigrants, and also these kind of art grads, art school grads from across the U.S. who gather there, and both the connections they make and the frictions and the misunderstandings. And so I love, we have on the one hand this really kind of sci-fi action filled kind of action thriller type web series or TV show. And then we have this really poetic, artistic documentary about the kind of nitty-gritty of these as you say, like people all within, one might call them within a trans community, but who are really different in terms of what language they speak, their citizenship, their what they like to do with their time, how they dress, all that thing, all that stuff, and how they try to connect and both succeed and fail. And so that's what I like to do with the book is to show how like you can use really different genre and aesthetic techniques to kind of get at similar questions and both of them are more interesting than your kind of typical cis narrative that's like, oh, look, here's a trans person. Have they had the surgery?
Yeah, and how what a struggle it must have been, and and
Exactly.
fortunately, the wife stood by and
Exactly.
helped, and
Exactly.
I love the fact as well the Wachowskis. You go back and you watch their films because obviously we were all more or less, I
Yeah.
imagine, depending on your age, experiencing them through the lens of their assigned genders until they transitioned, and then you sort of go back and go, "Oh, hang on a minute, that's always
Yeah.
been about trans
It's always
identity,
been
hasn't
there. Yeah.
it?"
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when Bound came out and I was like, huh. Like, how did they do that? That's a really good lesbian film. How did two straight guys make a really good lesbian film? And then now you're like, oh, okay. It makes
Yeah,
more sense.
yeah.
Yeah.
Little did we know. And I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
I would like to sort of slightly defend the Crying Game because it's such a mishmash of political discourse about
Yeah.
Ireland, about violence, and you mentioned in the book, you say, like the Stephen Ray character is lying because he's actually responsible for the death of the guy's
Yes.
boyfriend. So
Yeah.
there's a whole series of things where I feel you're being, I mean, I know that was the sort of the marketing more than anything else, I feel. And yes, it was the butt of many. It became the joke. It became the Jay Leno bit and the Ace
Yeah.
Ventura bit
Exactly.
that you
Yeah.
describe. But yeah, that's
No, I agree. I think the film is much more complex and interesting than the role it came to play in culture, you know?
yeah, right.
Um, yeah, and it is, if you actually watch the movie, it is, yeah, complicated. And it is Stephen Rea who is the kind of, the person who shouldn't be trusted, right? Rather than the
Mm.
trans person who's like traditionally put in that role. And he remains in love with the character too. So, yeah, I think that's part of what um one of the points of the book is that films are actually really good at complexity, in fact.
Mm.
And I think even films like The Crying Game, which have been used to sort of bash trans, especially women, on the head with, with and all of the parodies that have come after. But that oftentimes in politics, Well, of course, the sort of anti-trans side is using caricatures of trans people as villains that are very similar, right, to these caricatures that we see earlier on in cinema, like in the horror films and things. But also, the side that is defending trans people often has to make just a really kind of thin account of trans life to say, oh, trans people, they're all good people, they're all good citizens, they pay their taxes. And it's like, yeah, trans people need defending, and I think whatever strategy you can find, go ahead and use that. But no one can be described as just this, like, purely virtuous, wholesome, good citizen. Like that's not a human way to be. And so but I think this is what's so great about compared to sort of like political discourse, is that films really are able to get into like that complexity and get into the messiness of identity, of desire, of community, that it's not all love and rainbows all the time, so that's what I love about movies is that they have room, they're capacious, they have room for all of that.
Absolutely, you're preaching to the choir. I used to have a professor who told me life is wider than argument, John. And
Oh, that's good. I like that. Yeah,
isn't
yeah,
it? Isn't it? It's
yeah,
just like, so whenever I feel that I've nailed something, even that language, I nailed it. It's like,
yeah.
be careful because you're nailing jelly to the wall. You're not really, it's
Absolutely.
not even appropriate to do such a thing. Um, one of the sort of communities and the families that you, and it's in the subtitle as well to some degree of your book, is the idea of festivals that is an encouragement. We've already talked about this a little bit. Where do you see? I think there's a sort of vulgar, sort of outside looking in version of trans identity and trans culture. It's like, oh, it's vogue now. Everybody, you're getting all
Yeah.
the funding, you're getting all the thing, and I very much assume, just the fact that this book is filling such a gap shows that that actually is not the case. That there isn't a lot of encouragement for. So what is the context of filmmakers now, trans filmmakers, and getting their work seen? And I also wanted to ask, as a supplement to that, is your did you find it difficult to get your book published? Is there a problem with just going to publishers and saying, "Look, I want to write on this," and then like, well, you know.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. So, I think, as I kind of mentioned before, there's these waves of interest in trans, also in lesbian. I talk about this in my book about lesbianism in the teens and 20s. There was like a wave of interest in lesbians, and then everyone forgot about them, and then there was another wave of interest. So it's not unique to trans, but so, and there's even a great, when was it? In the 80s, I found this great column in one of the trans community newspapers about how Hollywood is all into us now, but like, how long will that last? And will they really care once, our enemies start assembling against us? And I was like, wow, that was very prescient, to be writing that in the 80s. It's exactly what has happened in the 2010s. Let's see. Remind me of your question because there were several parts of it and I
Yeah,
forgot.
there were. I piled on several. Well, let's talk first of all because we talked a little bit about festivals earlier as well. So maybe we've
Oh
covered
yeah,
that a
festivals.
little bit. But also, just in terms of your own publications, was it when you proposed this, you pitched it? Was that okay? Did you find it difficult to find a publisher?
Luckily I did not find it difficult to find a publisher because I think just as much as there is this very strong backlash to trans lives, to trans people in the UK and the US, also somewhat in Canada, there's a lot of people fighting on the side of trans people too. And so the different editors I talked to, they immediately saw that this was important work. And in fact, I was pitching it before the latest Trump administration, like extra backlash, and so things were not as dire back then as they were now. But it was clear to them that this work hadn't been done and that it needed to be done. And I will say too, I'm part of a whole wave of of scholars who are doing this work, and a lot of great grad students too who are coming up and doing the work. The amount of people doing this work is really exploding, although the number of jobs is not exploding, so that is a real problem right now. I asked my publisher though when the Trump administration, when the second Trump administration started, and he announced on the first day that there's only male and female, and there's no way to cross between them, and that of supporting children's gender identities was a kind of mutilation. Like it was really fast and really, really negative and going to the heart of transhuman rights right away. And also, soon after, he started going after universities specifically. And so I asked my press, like, is this going to be a problem? Are you guys going to be shut down? Are you going to not publish my book or, or not advertise it? And they said, no, like, we haven't been asked to change anything about our publishing practices, but also if we do, we're going to fight because this is important. This is academic freedom. This is what research is. This is why we do our job. So I am really grateful to have the strong support of my editor and my press. And I've talked to other presses about additional projects I'm working on, and they all said the same thing, that like this kind of work is really important to us, and so we will fight to be able to do it. So I have been very lucky, and I must say though, I'm very lucky to be in Canada, where I can get federal grants for this kind of research. In the US, all the funding has disappeared, and many people doing this kind of research have been specifically targeted, both by the administration, but also by, Fox News, Libs of TikTok, like a lot of right-wing organizations. So, I mean, we have a right wing here in Canada, but it's not nearly as strong, or I should say a far right, really, as it is in the U.S. or in Britain for that matter. Um, so I'm very lucky to be in Canada, but my U.S. based publisher, University of California, they could not have been more supportive.
Yeah, that's excellent to hear. But it is interesting that well, interesting in the sense of the curse, may you live in interesting times,
Yeah,
that you have this context of the book where you have filmmakers actually changing their work because they're aware that there is a coordinated effort to
yeah,
seize and clip their work and use it
that's
against
right.
them. And that strikes me
Hmm.
as an incredibly difficult context in which to produce art.
Oh yeah, yeah. And as I said, we have this transgender media portal, which we launched in June 2024. And, a few months later, in February 2025, I was like, have we done the right thing in publishing a long list of trans creators just at the very moment that the government is taking aim at trans people and trying to deny them rights and healthcare? And so we reached out to everyone in the portal who we could get a hold of and asked, like, do you still want to be in it? This is a hard time to be out on the internet as trans, and a number of people, maybe 10 or 15, said, yeah, take me down, please. I don't feel safe. And since then, we every month maybe we get requests to get taken down, and we take them down right away. But a lot of people said, yeah, I get why you're emailing me, but no, like it's all the more important for us to know that we're not alone, and that we have a community, and that all these people are making work, and this work is even more important, being able to see trans-made films at this time when say the mainstream media is increasingly turned against us. So I was glad to hear that a lot of people felt like it was worth the risk to their safety in order to provide resources to other trans people who needed them.
Absolutely. I mean, I've never known a moment like this moment when there has been such a coordinated, funded political backlash against a group. I've lived through I grew up in the 70s, lived through the 80s. I've seen Clause 24
Yeah.
in Thatcher's Britain. I've seen homophobia. I grew up in a relatively homophobic community, northern working class English, not necessarily homophobic, but generally homophobic. And yet, and so I have perceived sort of like a relatively a progress, ups and downs, but a progress. But then the
Yeah.
level of vitriol and the level of coordination here and cynicism as well. It feels like it's being used to attack the whole idea of human rights as well as specifically transhuman rights.
Yeah. I often think like, oh, all those things that happened in history that I was like, that it was so horrible. How could people let that happen? I'm like, oh, now I get it. You know, now I see, like even like Japanese internment camps in the US. I'm like, how could they do that? And I'm like, oh, now we have internment camps again. And obviously a lot of people are fighting it, which is really important. But I see like how people's kind of fears get appropriated by politicians and other people in order to really just sort of describe whole portions of the human race as non-human, and therefore you can do what you want, and as threats, right? Like they're the real that's the twist, that trans people who are the ones who are more often subject to violence are being cast as the ones who are doing potential violence to cis women, right? It's like this weird turnaround.
I mean, that's almost been the history of cinema, hasn't it? It's sort of like cowboys and Indians,
Yeah, it's true. Precisely. Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, definitely. It's the exact same thing. As the settlers are stealing indigenous land, it's like the indigenous people who are the real threat to the white wife and child, Yeah. So it is sadly like a kind of stock story in cinema. But I mean, this was one reason I really felt that the chapter on resisting, what is it, violence, police, and prisons, I think it's called.
Mm,
Um,
that's
yes,
cool.
that's it. Was important, even though it can be really hard for especially like trans people reading that chapter, because I have a lot of statistics about the violence against trans people and the way they're over policed and the kind of treatment they get in when they're incarcerated, which is horrendous. I mean, it's like torture. But that chapter is not about like trans people as victims. It's about how, especially Black trans women, Latina trans women, sex workers have forever been organizing and supporting each other, and as it says, resisting these systems that are constantly marking them for death. And so today, when so many trans people are being attacked, I think we all have a lot to learn from these, say, Black trans sex workers who have been under attack for since the beginning, and they have organized and they have had successes and they have managed to survive together and managed to prevent some of the worst harms, and they have supported each other in terms of food and housing and sense of self and stuff. So I think so. One of the films I talk about is called Major, about Miss Major Griffin Gracie, who is a Black trans sex worker who becomes a prison activist after going to prison, and her life is just incredible, and it's not a tragedy by any means. It's about all of the community that she built around her, all of the activism, all of the feelings of care. Of She would adopt other trans women, often who came out of prison, as daughters and granddaughters, and so. I think that film is a really good example of how you can look this violence straight on in the face and not be in denial, but then also how you can use that to build power together. As people who are victimized by the system, you can create something amazing. So I think we have a lot to learn from those activists and from these films that have been made about them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point to make, and we've got to try to support and be allies as much as possible. One of the final questions, there's a couple of final questions as you can imagine, but one
Sure.
final question is, I guess it was a really interesting chapter in terms of or sub-chapter that you called, I love this phrase, a pedagogy of porn, and you have next to it the pedagogy of drama, of sort of like what we can learn through this. And you make the very good point that for a lot of people, the viewing of a trans body takes place via porn, and porn now is something which is so widespread. It's so a part of
Hmm.
daily life for so many people. Yeah, usually would be seen as a form of exploitation, and in fact, frequently is a form of exploitation. But also, you talk about feminist porn and the possibilities of visibility and expression.
Yeah, yeah. That chapter was fun on like dating and love and sex. And yeah, porn is really controversial. Certainly, if you talk to any given trans people, some people will find it really objectifying and offensive. Others will say that they find it really valuable to be to have their bodies be so desired and desirable, and they might find it, arousing and things. So you have the whole spectrum. So I guess I would put myself somewhere in the middle where like working conditions are really important. Certainly, porn can be really exploitative, and sometimes people working in it like are not making fully like agentic choices. But two, in these trans film festivals that started in 1997, in all three of them, they all had porn programs.
Hmm.
So porn that was made by trans people was always really important to trans film curators, because I think part of the battle in society about trans people is whether their bodies were disgusting, right, or laughable, like because that was the standard trope in cinema, and so porn shows that trans bodies can be extremely desirable and very varied as well. Like there is no, there's a kind of standard trope in mainstream trans porn, but if you have trans people making porn, you have all kinds of genders, all kinds of bodies, all kinds of genitals, all kinds of actions, you know. There's a huge variety, and sex and sexuality and sexual desire can be like really affirming of trans bodies, and trans people. And so I thought it was really important. And there's a lot, as you mentioned, of like specifically feminist, queer, and trans pornographers whose goal is to show that variety and to show the that there's not one standard way that you have to look in order to be desirable as a trans person. And so I thought it was important to include that part of the story too, that there is, just like, trans cinema is not any one thing, trans porn is not any one thing either. And it doesn't just do one thing, but it can have a really important role in what I talk about in that chapter about how media always is kind of training our desires. It's telling us, oh, this is attractive, this is hot, or this is silly, this is ugly. And yes, we're not just slaves to media. We have our own tastes and we don't just agree with everything we see, but it does have a big impact on us, I think. It doesn't only have to train us to say, oh, very slender white blonde women are attractive. Like that's maybe what mainstream media tends to do. But if you watch different kinds of media, you can become interested in all different kinds of people. I mean, we see this with the like fat liberation, that like one part of that movement is to train us to say like what the media tells us about body sizes doesn't have to be how we intrinsically think. Like we can start to resist that. And so I think that media, not just porn, all kinds of media about sex and romance and love, can just invite us to start to like have different kinds of desires than maybe we would if we just watched only Hollywood fare.
Absolutely, yeah. Not don't succumb to just one stream of training.
Exactly.
It's so funny how a lot of these people who talk about things which are natural, 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 then insist
Right.
on you being trained to fit very narrow parameters.
I know, I know. I took a class in college called the Sociology of Heterosexuality, and it was all about how we're trained to be like in our society to be heterosexual in this one way. It's like we have proms, we have like romance novels, we have all these rules about gender that everyone's enforcing all the time. But if it was so natural, you wouldn't have to be enforced. You wouldn't have to be disciplined all the time, right? Like clearly there's a lot of cultural work going into making things like quote unquote normal.
Yeah, if half the men I know throw like a girl, maybe it's not throwing like a girl.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yep.
Brilliant. Well, listen, Laura, I've had a wonderful time talking to you, and it's been a real education for me. I'm a cis straight guy, so my exposure to queerness comes through life, obviously, through meeting lots of different people. But cinema has also been a way I have had experience of the internal experiences of living these different realities. I would like, as a last question for you, a recommendation for a film book. We've already sort of given quite a few recommendations of films, but if you want to throw in any films as well, that's more than welcome for our listeners, I'm sure.
Sure. I'll start with the film because I actually haven't talked about my very favorite one so far, which is Lingua Franca by Isabel Sandoval. It's a beautiful kind of art drama about a trans immigrant from the Philippines who takes care of an older immigrant woman in Brooklyn, and the main character is played by the director. And Sandoval has a brand new film that just came out that I'm looking forward to seeing. I think it was at Tribeca a little while ago. So she's someone to watch. And other film books, I know Cale Keegan, who I mentioned, has a new book coming out about the Silence of the Lambs. So he's precisely looking at a kind of trans interest or in reclaiming Buffalo Bill and Silence of the Lambs. So I think that will be really interesting. He's also written some great short pieces on Rocky Horror Picture Show and Sleepaway Camp that are available for free online. Um, if you're interested in experimental trans cinema, Eliza Steinbach's book called Shimmering Images is really good. And there's Travell Anderson wrote a great, they're a non-binary film critic, and they talk about their life through movies. And so they do some really interesting reflections on the role of trans cinema in their own sort of sense of self. So I can recommend their book too.
Excellent. That sounds like a great list of books to be getting on with, and those films. Isabel Sandoval. Yeah, I think that film might have shown at Cannes or Berlin because I definitely recognized it was one of the ones that was on my
Yeah.
list, and then I never managed to see, as often happens at these
Okay, great.
festivals.
Yeah.
But Laura, thank
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
so much for joining me. I've really appreciated it.
Thank you too.
And remember, everybody, if you can like, subscribe, spread the word about Writers on Film, I will really appreciate it because that's the only advertising I ever get. So thank you very much. And until next time, take care.